Order, and welcome to this week's session of the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee. We are delighted to be joined by the representatives of the National Energy Systems Operator, and we will be taking evidence from you as part of our work in scrutinising the work of the department and its arm's length body. So if you would please introduce yourselves briefly.
Good afternoon, my name's Fintan Slye. I'm the Chief Executive of National Energy System Operator, or NESO.
Okay. Good afternoon, thanks very much for the invitation to sit with the committee today. I'm Kayte O'Neill, Chief Operating Officer at NESO.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, you published your Clean Power by 2030 report just a few weeks ago, and indeed you were formally established only on the 1st of October, so you've been very busy. In the report, you described Clean Power by 2030 as a huge challenge, requiring once-in-a-generation shift in approach and in the pace of delivery. You said that either of the two pathways tests the limits of feasibility. Either of these requires a dramatic acceleration in progress compared to anything achieved historically, and can only be achieved with a determined focus on pace and a huge collective effort across the industry. How achievable is the Clean Power 2030 target?
So, undoubtedly, it is a challenging target to hit clean power by 2030, but we believe that it absolutely is achievable if we can make that acceleration that we talk about in the report. So I suppose to talk a little bit around why do we believe that it is achievable. So some of the big things in the report are the scale of network infrastructure that needs to be built. The plans for network infrastructure that are set out in the report are consistent with plans that the transmission operators have been working on for the past 2 years that were set out in our Beyond 2030 publication, and we've worked with them to make sure that the dates that we've set out are achievable and what would need to be done to make them achievable. In addition, the other very significant thing in the plan is the level of generation infrastructure that needs to be built. But all of the projects that are necessary to fulfill that are already in the connections queue, already have dates pre-2030. What we need to do, and which we're happy to talk about today, is we also are in the process of reforming that connections queue to make sure that we can bring forward the projects that are ready to go, that are consistent with the plan, and that will deliver benefits to economy and society. So it is undoubtedly, Chair, a hugely ambitious plan that we've set out here. We tried to set out what were the key things that would need to be true across markets, workforce and skills, supply chain, planning and consenting, and the reforms that were needed in order to make it achievable. But we believe if we can tackle all of those, and it's not just us, of course, it's a big effort across government, industry and the regulator. If those can be tackled, then we can achieve clean power by 2030.
Thank you. You suggest there might be flexibilities at the margin for some technologies to substitute for others that aren't delivering fast enough. How much room for manoeuvre do we really have?
So we set out two pathways to 2030 in the plan, as you will have seen. One of those pathways goes harder on renewables and on storage technology, so some level of flexibility. The other pathway introduces newer low-carbon dispatchable technologies and a bit more nuclear. And you'll see across those pathways, some of those technologies will be interchangeable, not necessarily on a sort of a one-for-one basis. So some technologies sort of provide some outsized value, if you like. So our new dispatchable pathway talked about the potential to introduce CCS and hydrogen projects. Those are fantastic projects in support of a clean power system if you can get them off the ground for 2030. Equally, you can build more renewables, and those are some of the trade-offs that we describe in the plan.
Bradley.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that the NESO report is conclusive proof that Clean Power 2030 will bring down bills? If it's not, do you think that there's a possibility that bills can raise? And do you think that system costs will increase or decrease relative to where they are today?
So the analysis that we did in the report was to look at what it would take to achieve clean power by 2030 and what were some of the system costs associated with doing that. And we set out all of the analysis and the assumptions underpinning all of that in a very transparent way. And we compared that with what the costs would be if the transition wasn't made. And what we can see is that those costs do not go up under a transition to clean power. And there is the opportunity for policy intervention or policy choices to be made that would reduce bills. But what we did not set out to do, and what is not our role, is to determine what bills are for consumers. That's a matter of policy. But in addition to looking at absolute level of costs on the system, we also looked at what were the range of volatility. So what would happen if there were spikes in prices, etc. So that transition to clean power also removes, to some extent, the exposure of consumers to really volatile international fossil fuel prices as well.
We had the Minister giving evidence to us last week on our retrofitting homes inquiry, and she made a comment on the need to recognise the importance of affordability, and indeed that she called it a consumer imperative. Do you think that her remarks last week are consistent, or what you're doing is consistent with what ministers are saying about the importance of keeping bills down?
So, I mean, absolutely, it's important that bills are kept down, and NESO was established under the Energy Act and has clear duties around affordability and association, in addition to security of supply and sustainability. So we absolutely look at that issue and believe that it is really important that bills for consumers are kept to a minimum, and acutely conscious that we're coming off a period of really high energy bills as a result of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis, and therefore trying to make sure that as we go forward we are really conscious of the effect of energy prices on people's household income.
Yeah, and the scale of infrastructure investment is absolutely colossal between now and 2030. Even with that scale of investment, you're confident that the consumer bills can be kept down?
Yes, we are, and again, as I say, we set out the analysis that underpins that in a really robust way, and I think it's important to note in that as well that you have sort of two things happening. One is a very significant investment programme, and that is investment in Great Britain, and we need to make sure that we capture the supply chain value for that in terms of jobs and economic value. But in addition to the capital investment that's going in, you also have a very significant reduction in the operating costs of the system, and in particular in the amount of fossil fuel that's needed on a year-to-year basis. So you have those two effects that to some extent share offset each other. So yes, it is a significant capital investment. It's an investment in Great Britain. It's an investment in Great Britain's energy system. And what it does do is significantly reduce the amount of operating costs on a year-to-year basis of our energy system, and specifically it reduces the amount of gas that we need to buy and burn in those power stations.
So lower use of gas is key to getting bills down. Okay, thank you for that. Bradley, Thomas, back to you for the next set of questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So how will you ensure that the sprint to 2030 doesn't distract us from developing key infrastructure and technology needed for 2050?
Yeah, it's a great point, and one that we've consistently made ourselves. Actually, this isn't about just delivering for 2030. We're very, very focused on what will be needed on the system through the 2030s and beyond to get us to net zero. It's worth saying that when we think about both what is required that we've set out in the Clean Power 2030 plan, it's a moment in time. We're actually already, as part of NESO's new roles, have a set of obligations that will help us to strategically plan the system way beyond 2030. So you might have heard of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, sometimes referred to as SSEP, sorry to throw the acronym in there. That's NESO's opportunity sort of on behalf of GB to think about the energy system out to 2040, 2045 and beyond. And in fact, that's consistent with the role that we've had in sort of planning future energy scenarios, even as the electricity system operator. So features very heavily in our thinking as a strategic planner. It also features very heavily in how we think about things like connections reform. You know, we need to make some material changes to our processes by which folks will engage with the energy system. Connections reform is about ensuring that we can get the right projects that we need for GB growth, for the economy, onto the system, that we can connect new demand and maximise the value of that. But again, it's not just a 2030 argument. The other thing I would say is that sort of NESO for the longer term is then looking out at, you know, how do we ensure that we are set up for net zero. One of my roles is ensuring that, you know, 24/7, 365, the lights stay on, and that sort of ongoing security of supply and resilience of the system is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, not just what will it take to operate the system today, but what will it take to operate the system out in the future.
Okay, you touched upon SSEP. What's the timescale for that, and what kind of consultation do you think you'll be engaging in?
Yep, so consultation is at the heart of our approach to all of our strategic planning. So just last week, in fact, we launched, or at the beginning of this week, we launched our first consultation on the SSEP. So that was a consultation on the methodology that we will use to do this strategic planning. That consultation will run over Christmas, and we'll publish final methodologies early next year. And then over the course of 2025, we'll actually be out sort of developing early versions of that plan. And that theme of consultation will serve us right the way throughout 2025, whether that's formally through the governance that we've put in place, which brings multiple stakeholders together, sort of nationally, regionally, locally, and also about getting out into communities and ensuring that they're on board as we're developing those strategic plans. The final version of the SSEP we expect to be delivered the following year, so in 2026.
Okay, and then one final one. You've spoken about carbon capture being important but underdeveloped. What kind of decisions do you think you need to see from government to develop that at pace?
So I think we're already starting to see some of those. There was an announcement about Teesside recently as well. So what we're seeing is government push forward with development in the clusters, and we're seeing private developers bring forward individual projects in those clusters. And part of doing the work on the Clean Power 2030 advice was to engage with all of those, just to make sure that, you know, across all of those developers, what we were proposing was realistic and could be delivered by them, and we believe that it can. We're seeing the progression of those sort of discussions with the clusters progress, and obviously, you know, that needs to move forward in order to get that sort of CCS infrastructure. And it's the storage, the transport and storage carbon, the infrastructure for the transport and storage of carbon, along with then the individual developers building the power stations with the carbon capture technology on them. You need all of those bits to come together.
Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Chair. Hiya. Your SSEP proposes a more coordinated approach to how the UK uses land for energy infrastructure. I was just wondering if you could give us a bit more detail on how these plans will work alongside local and regional plans for growth, especially to promote growth, especially in light of the government's devolution revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we've put together the governance and the approach to undertaking those strategic energy plans, or the SSEP, we've been very focused on ensuring we've got all of the right parties at the table to ensure that it is a properly informed plan that isn't just about the national picture, but is about bringing the national picture together with the regional or indeed local picture and finding a way to ensure that those two things connect. So, for example, from a governance perspective, and I know governance isn't everything, but it's a good place for where we convene the right stakeholders. At the most senior levels of governance for the SSEP, we have Scottish and Welsh government sitting alongside NESO and DESNZ along with the regulator, and then underneath that top layer of governance we've got all sorts then of boards, for example out community and society board, environmental boards, so all sorts of different groups that will bring stakeholders together for the conversation to make sure that what we're delivering is going to meet all of those needs. I might also just say, if you don't mind, that as well as the SSEP, which is the national strategic plan, if you like, NESO has a role in regional energy strategic planning as well. That was a new role that we took on as we became NESO just 9 weeks ago. And in that role, we'll have a very active presence and participation in regional and local conversations. So we'll actually set up regional offices where we will be out engaging with groups on the ground, with local authorities, with regional stakeholders who do have a good sense of the needs of those local communities and local areas, and ensuring that their ambition, their aspiration is well understood, that we think about what are the trade-offs and opportunities within that region and then across regions as we build back up to the national plan. So I think it was a real positive shift actually as we took on our new roles as NESO. That's one of the ones I'm really excited about. I think we can make a real difference.
Thanks very much. We'll come back to that point a bit later on. Josh McAllister.
Yes, thanks very much. I just want to turn specifically to the role of nuclear in both of the pathways. Given its importance as a source of firm power generation for both options, can you just talk us through why the deployment targets differ between the two and your thinking behind that? And then I've got a couple more follow-up questions as well.
Yeah, so nuclear, we agree with you, is a very, very important part of the mix, and we extensively engaged actually with stakeholders to get a good sense of what was an appropriate forecast for nuclear as part of the plan. We, in discussion with government, with the regulator, with the nuclear companies themselves, tried to get an understanding of what do we think is most likely to be on the system and what would it take for that to change. So in both scenarios, in both of the pathways, you see Sizewell on the system, you see one of the units at Hinckley on the system. We assume some life extension of existing AGRs. And we recognise that there is room for movement around that, and whatever nuclear can provide in 2030 would be a welcome part of the system mix for sure.
And just your view on why it differs between the two models, and what some of the trade-offs are there. Just useful to understand some of the thinking there on the target dispatch number.
So I think the reason was at the time that we were doing the CP30 advice, the EDF were still in the process of working through life extensions on their fleet and what that looked like in 2030, and there was some uncertainty over where that would land, and therefore we just wanted to reflect that in the thing because it wasn't a certain, and we didn't want to nail it down to a specific number given they were still in that process.
So has that changed now then?
Yeah, I was going to ask, the extensions that have been announced, do they take you to the number in the new dispatch pathway?
Yes, they do. Back to the earlier discussion, I suppose, around beyond 2030, those life extensions are typically extending some of those plants out to 2030, and therefore we'd also need to look beyond that as well. But yes, the life extensions are consistent with the plan here, and more consistent with the new dispatch pathway than the other one, yes.
Have you been able to extend into any commentary beyond the 2030 goal? Because of course life extension of existing plants simply, if there's no fleet replacement, just pushes the problem further out on long-term sustainability. They can't be extended forever. So have you looked beyond 2030 at the kind of stacking of extensions without a sufficient pipeline of new deployment of new plants?
I think the issue of life extensions of nuclear plants is a really difficult one, and for EDF and the nuclear safety regulator to work through, and it certainly we haven't looked at sort of what it would look like to stack them. But as you look beyond 2030, we will see the second unit at Hinkley come on. We know that the government programme around small modular reactors is now starting to accelerate with the request for proposals and stuff, and would hope to see that come out as well. So there is a clear ambition, I think, for nuclear to be a significant part of the mix as we go into the 2030s. Yeah. To the earlier discussion, we very much we don't see 2030 as an end in itself. 2030 is sort of the stepping stone into that.
And just to be super clear on the extension of existing plants, so some of the plants are only being extended for an additional year, but you're saying that the announced extensions take you to the target dispatch number that is in the new dispatch pathway?
Yes, I believe so, yes.
Okay.
Just looking at what you said about the new dispatch pathway, I think you indicated you predicted that gas would still be used 47% of the time. Have I got that right?
4.7 maybe.
Okay, I will be happily corrected.
Oh. Hours. Sorry, is that it? Sorry.
You want to check and come back to us?
Oh, sorry. The hours in which gas is used. Sorry, that's not. So gas will still represent just less than 5% of the overall energy mix. There may be some hours in which it's used for a small amount. Sorry. Overall, apologies for the confusion.
Not still overall 4.7% of the time. Right. What is it for the other pathway? I couldn't find that.
In percentage terms, it's similarly 5%.
They're both about 5%.
Yeah, but the number of hours for which it runs might be different.
Something put to me is that you've estimated a very high gas price and CO2 price. You're predicting continued uncertainty. Why have you only gone for one level? Why haven't you put 2 or 3 different price levels in for comparison?
Yeah, so the gas price that we picked is, and the carbon price that we picked is consistent with the assumptions that we made when we did our future energy scenarios work, which is an annual publication that we make. It's consulted with over 3,000 stakeholders. We've been doing it for more than the last 10 years, so it is nearly like our Bible for where the evolution of the energy system.
When you say we, you've only been around for 11 weeks.
Sorry, our predecessor, you're quite right, Chair, apologies. Our predecessor organisation, the Electricity System Operator, has been publishing this. It is it's a heavily researched piece of work that we do in a very open and transparent way. There's consultation and engagement with over 3,000 stakeholders to develop it. And we started our clean power advice and our clean power analysis with those core assumptions transferred from that as a good base of what we believe the price to be. We are really conscious that, of course, the analysis is only good as the assumptions you make and the inputs you put into any model. And as part of that, therefore, we did flex some of those core assumptions, including gas price, carbon price, capital costs. And in the cost analysis that we did in the main report and in the appendices, we published sensitivities about how it would change the overall costs with sort of a high and a low range, both for the counterfactual and for the two dispatch pathways, because of that issue that we knew that there was a range that was possible in that.
The report says 47%, not 4.7.
Sorry, yes. So, two things which I have confused the committee on, right? So one is the amount of energy over the course of a year produced from unabated gas-fired generation, and in both pathways that is less than 5%.
Yeah.
And apologies, I thought that was the 4.7.
Right.
However, there is also in the report we say the number of hours, or the percentage number of hours in the year where there is some gas generation running at something, which is the 47%.
So would still be used in 47% of periods, right? Okay.
In 47% at some level. So apologies, that was completely my fault, Chair.
And is that the same for both pathways?
No, it's less in the further flex and renewable pathway. It's 15%.
It's 15% further.
Yes.
Right, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Apologies.
Thank you for coming. Can I just sort of understand a little bit more generally, in terms of the energy transition, it's not just transitioning away from CO2 or fossil carbons, but also the whole energy future looks different. We used to have sort of big centralized generators, and now it's all decentralized and little and all the rest of it. So when you're talking about dispatchable energy, how should one think about this, how you plan for it, how do you model it, because it is very uncertain. Is there a sort of particular model that you used, or look at the weather, for example, and weather patterns? How should one imagine that in order to get an understanding how much dispatchable you need and how much sort of what people call baseload, or is baseload an outdated concept anyway?
It's an excellent question. So let me try. So we use the term dispatchable to mean large power stations on the system where we in the control room can tell them what to do and they will move and do it. So that is, say, a gas-fired plant, for example. So it is dispatchable in that the engineer in the control room can tell that gas-fired power station to run at 750 megawatts or 850 megawatts. So that's how we use the term dispatchable in this. But you also have the term distributed generation and large-scale generation. So that typically refers to as where on the system it's connected. So the distributed generation is smaller, it's connected down in the distribution system, and it tends to be autonomous. So that means it either runs based on its own schedule, perhaps it's an tied to an industrial plant and it's running, or it runs in with the weather. So if it's a wind farm, it runs with the weather. In terms of the modelling that we do, then we model every hour of the year over an entire year against a set of weather patterns as well. So we look at what is a typical weather year, what is the portfolio of generation that we have, what is the demand shape that we have, and we have a really detailed model, analytical model that runs and solves for every single hour of the year and works out, well, in this hour there's so much wind, there's so much solar, therefore that's how much they give, this is how much I need to get from my nuclear fleet, this is how much will come from gas-fired generation. And the other part of it, which is increasingly a part of our energy mix and a part of the energy story, is the demand-side participation in the energy system. So in this report, and one of the things that as NESO we're really strong on doing, is trying to make this not about just assuming what the level of demand is and then matching generation with it, but actually seeing is there flexibility in that demand. So are there things that industrial customers could do to provide that flexibility, and therefore on their side they get cheaper electricity, cheaper energy, and the system benefits because it's more flexible as well. So all of those things go into, we have an analytical model that models all those out, produces it by year, and then the other thing that we do is we stress test that against abnormal weather patterns. So that does a standard year, but then we need to make sure that if you have what's called the Duncan-Flaute effect, which is where you have potentially many days, potentially 2 weeks of really still weather, basically in the middle of winter, a high pressure sitting over the top of Great Britain, you're going to have really cold days. you're going to have really still winds. It's winter, so you don't get much out of your solar fleet. If that continues for, say, 7, 8, 9, 10 days, are we absolutely confident that we can keep the lights on? Because, you know, one of the absolutes in both of these pathways and in any analysis we do is that they meet the security of supply things. So, did that...
Thank you.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I mean, because it was an outside question, but I wanted to understand.
Yeah,
I'm happy to, you know, I'm a bit of a geeky engineer at heart, so happy to dive into that offline.
We'll come back to some of these things as we go, I'm sure. Next question is Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Chair. Given the volume of transmission infrastructure needed, coupled with the supply chain and workforce pressures, is the higher target of 50 gigawatts from the further flex pathway actually achievable, given that you've already described the lower offshore wind target of 43 gigawatts as challenging?
So we do believe from the research, from all of the analysis that's gone into the report, that we can achieve those higher levels of development of those renewables, and also that we can deliver the network in order to get them connected to the grid and get that power moving around. But as you say, we did focus heavily in the Clean Power report on what will it take for that to be possible, and we focused exactly on the things that you've described there. So the ability for investors to have the certainty and the confidence that the market frameworks, the policies, etc., will exist to confidently bring that investment to GB is really important for the transmission companies, and a clear understanding that the regulatory funding is there for them to focus on getting that network infrastructure built. And then there's been a lot of discussion about how do you unlock the supply chain, and not just unlock the supply chain in a really fast way that forgets the potential opportunity for GB here. Lots of the conversations that we had with stakeholders, and we talked extensively to stakeholders through the process, was focused on a supply chain that genuinely brings those benefits here. We talk about the Sumitomo cable factory that was established up in Scotland. That's a great example. I think, if I remember, something like £350 million worth of investment brought by being able to bring that supply chain here. It's those types of sort of advanced efforts that I think would be needed to give us the confidence that we'll be able to deliver the generation and deliver the transmission network. And as Fintan mentioned earlier, of course, we need to solve connections reform to make sure that we can get all of that operational and on the system. But those processes are already underway.
Yeah, just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, because one of the areas in your Clean Power report that doesn't go into too much detail, although you've just touched on it, is the issue of procurement and supply chains. And we know that there's a global shortage of power cables and an imminent shortage of off-wind components as well. What is the position on these being manufactured after those talks with stakeholders in the UK, or for a certain amount of capital expenditure to take place here to make it a more resilient supply chain and also jobs?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, from my perspective, I think even the concept of moving to a much more strategic approach to planning in and of itself is helpful for ensuring that sort of confidence that there is an investment to be made here, that it is signed off by the government, that the regulator is behind it, and that the companies here who are to deliver those programmes of work are absolutely committed to getting them done. And I know, talking to the transmission owners and to Ofgem, they have agreed between them that there can be sort of anticipatory signals sent to the market for supply chain, so they can make those sort of commitments as to the overall level of network infrastructure that needs to be built. And rather than seek approval on a project-by-project basis, which isn't enough to attract the supply chain to Great Britain, you signal it on a much larger scale and give a sense of the full opportunity. And like with the cable factory I was just referring to, we've seen that be really successful. Similarly, of course, you have to solve the skills part as well. And one of the things that came across really clearly from stakeholders is we have an opportunity now through programmes like the Skills Passport to help support that transition of jobs, whether it's from oil and gas industry into the wind industry, for example. But that opportunity exists today. We need to make a conscious decision that we do want to retain those jobs in GB, that we do want to invest in helping folks make that skills transition. The beauty of strategic planning is, you can set out that North Star, that vision, if you like, get the commitment to it, and I think that sends a strong signal for those types of programmes, be it supply chain or skills, that will be needed to run to 2030 and indeed beyond.
Great, thank you. And so given the investment need to meet recommended renewable deployment targets, how do you reconcile that with your continued support for zonal pricing?
So, don't believe that the two are inconsistent at all. I think that our analysis of... So we've worked through what market frameworks are needed, and I think there's general agreement that the current framework that exists really isn't suitable for a net zero world, and therefore it needs to change and evolve. Our assessment of the options that are out there, and in particular at the moment the discussion is around zonal pricing versus national pricing, is that including a locational element like zonal pricing will deliver very significant benefits to consumers, and DESNES have done studies on it, and Ofgem have done studies on it, and the consumer benefits are tens of billions of pounds in both studies. However, we do need to recognise, of course, that is a change, and it is a significant change to how the market works. And to do that at a time when we're also looking for private capital to make very significant investments, as you say, in renewable technologies and carbon capture and storage or whatever, we need to make sure that we provide that government ultimately provide a really clear pathway on how the market develops. And it's not just a question of the wholesale pricing mechanism, so that sort of zonal versus national question. It is also, you need to work out how do all of the investment support mechanisms work with that. So how will contracts for differences work for that? How will the cap and floor regime for interconnectors work with that? How will the capacity market work with that? Such that investors have the confidence that even though there is a change in the wholesale pricing mechanism, they know and understand how that will happen. They can model it, and that when they model that change with also the change in the investment support mechanisms, that it is a reasonable risk-return investment for them to make. And there are models around the world where zonal pricing and nodal pricing has been used and developed, and where renewables investments and generation investments thrive and flourish. So this absolutely can be done. But I think it's really, really important that it's done in a very measured and sensible way, because the very point you make, it is a huge amount of capital that needs to be committed. And it is private capital that's doing the heavy lifting on this Clean Power 2030 plan. And we need to really make sure that if we're asking investment committees in publicly traded companies to make that commitment, that they can make it against a set of market arrangements that they clearly understand, that they can make sense, that they can model, that they can trust. And that is about the totality of it. And I think that's the magic will be to be able to change the wholesale mechanism, the investment support mechanisms that exist around it at the same time, and provide clarity over that transition path, because these things take time. Even if a decision was made now to go with zonal, it would likely be 4 or 5 years before that actually. So what does that transition look like for investments in that period? And what is the grandfathering for people who've already made investment decisions around today's model? Mm-hmm. And we do not want to inadvertently disturb, if you like, the investment promise that exists in GB, because it is a great place to invest because we have investor certainty in that. So it's a really difficult issue. I suppose I don't believe that our Clean Power 2030 advice, and that is incompatible with a move to zonal pricing. But I believe that you have to manage that transition, if that is the decision to transition to zonal pricing, in a very, very measured and clear way, and that brings investors with us.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. We've been talking to you about the two pathways. The government's already, you've already talked about the government's announcements on CCS. There's the hydrogen for power announcement as well. Hasn't that decision effectively been made? Or do you still think there's a choice to be made between the two? Which of the pathways do you recommend, or do you think is likely, if my assumption is wrong?
As we set the pathways out in the report, it was never the intention that you had to pick one or the other of them. In fact, what we were hoping to convey is that, to some extent there is flexibility between the pathways, and given the scale of the challenge to get to 2030, that flexibility, that optionality, if you like. So if we do make progress on CCS and hydrogen, fantastic. And if we don't, you can build more renewables. That was a really important part of us laying out routes to 2030. I don't expect that government will pick one pathway or another per se. One of the things
that's very helpful. Just go back to something that you said, Fintan, about not disturbing existing investment. To what extent do investors need certainty one way or the other? Or are you confident that having that sort of balance between the two pathways is absolutely fine for giving confidence and not undermining investment confidence?
I think you can manage the two, Chair, and I think that the key thing will be because investors are looking at the specifics of the project that they're looking at. So in CCS, what they will look at is what is the overall policy position with respect to CCS within the overall energy mix, not just in 2030, but out beyond that. And then what are the specifics of the arrangements that are being put in place, and in the case of CCS it will be in one of the clusters that they are looking at. So what are the specifics of the investment proposal or the support proposal that's been put in place for that one? So we never saw this plan and the pathways as being select one or the other and then just fill up those generation mixes to exactly that. The purpose of the pathways was to explore where there was optionality or trade-offs. The reality is, of course, when you look at the two pathways, the vast majority is the same across all of them. Like in both of them, offshore wind does the heavy lifting. There are some differences, but the pathways are very similar actually in the core part of what they are.
Okay. That's helpful, thank you. Vera Hophouse.
Let's come to the difficult issue of planning and planning consent that takes long and the delays in the system. Have you had any thoughts around how maybe the planning system could be sped up while not riding roughshod over community and community consent?
Yes, we talked in our report about planning being one of the critical keys that you do need to unlock. When we talk to the transmission owners, we have seen historically it can take something like 14 years to get new transmission infrastructure built in this country. And you might recall that last year or earlier this year, the Electricity Networks Commissioner, Nick Windsor, published a paper, a report for government, setting out what it would take to accelerate some of that investment. And again, planning was key there. As we understand it, it can be, 2 years or more sort of sitting, waiting for planning decisions on a large transmission infrastructure investment. And I know the transmission owners talking extensively with government about what it would take to get that down to a reasonable level. From our point of view, from NESO's point of view, through some of the work that we've done recently out in East Anglia, talking to communities who ultimately may host some of this infrastructure, we have that very strong sense of the need to bring communities with you as you sort of talk about planning and consenting in their footprint. And I think that's exactly the challenge that you're describing, to not just to achieve clean power. It's not about just hitting 2030, but to be able to unlock this investment in GB. It is really important that we can get stuff built, but we need to get stuff built in a way that does engage communities very, very early on in the process and bring communities with you through that journey.
We say that all the time. I think we said it for a long time. Have you got any ideas how to do that? Or have you made any proposals to the government what they need to do in order to speed up the planning process? And we had a consultation now from government. It's just this, it seems to be one of those sort of biggest blocks to a lot of progress towards net zero.
Yeah, so from our point of view, I think the biggest tool is having these strategic plans set out and well consulted on sort of throughout the process, and then ultimately signed off by government. So we talked earlier about the Spatial Strategic Energy Plan. That's the national plan that will look out to 2040 and beyond. I think if we can give a sense of the entirety of the energy system, where we think about building and connecting new large-scale infrastructure, whether that's new renewable generation or whether it's the network to move that power around the country. I think by having that national plan, by engaging communities, engaging society, the public more broadly in the need for that infrastructure, but particularly the communities who are going to be hosting it, with you through that process. And that's a very consultative process that will run over 2 years. But once that plan is established, I hope that actually is a key for being able to reduce planning timelines, because you're not going back over the need every single time you open up a conversation on the next transmission line or the next bit of generation.
Thank you very much. Fintan, Slye, when you were at AirGrid, there were concerns raised about electricity costs, about infrastructure installation, insistence on pylons, the ruling out of underground connections. All of these sound very familiar right now to what's going on in the UK. What are you doing differently this time? What are the lessons you've learned from your previous experiences on those points, and many more about delays and missed renewables targets and so on?
There's an excellent question, Sharon, and I think points out the fact that there is challenges right around the world in terms of building energy infrastructure. It's not easy to do anywhere. In my time in Ireland, when I was with AirGrid, we were looking at the time, a considerable expansion of the electricity transmission grid, and I think definitely took some learnings away from that, which hopefully we're bringing to the conversation here and bringing to how we engage here. One of them would be that you need to engage really early with communities, that having the conversation once many of the decisions have been taken, and just having a consultation about whether a pylon goes in one field or another field is not the conversation that communities want to have. Communities want to have an earlier conversation about what is the need for infrastructure at all, what were the options that were considered, and what were the trade-offs. And that involves conversations such as, well, what are the options for undergrounding things, what are the options for overhead, and what are the pros and cons of those things. And I think the development here of the SSEP and of the regional energy strategic plans is really, really helpful in that regard. The other piece that we found that was a lesson in Ireland was around making sure that there is a form of benefit for communities. Community benefit is, and it's not a silver bullet, it's not a panacea, it's not paying people off in any way. What it is it's recognizing that you're building infrastructure that benefits the country, it benefits society, it benefits the economy, but it does impact directly on a small subset of people in a community. And acknowledging that in some way through a community benefit scheme, and there are many ways to structure those, is an important part of bringing these projects forward. So there are a number of learnings. Hopefully, through my experience in Ireland and elsewhere, we're bringing those to bear on the infrastructure challenges that we see here. But as you say, many of the issues are similar and are similar in other countries when we talk to our colleagues and friends around Europe and other European TSOs. Yeah. They're seeing the same things around delays with transmission build, long connection queues to the system. So we're seeing all of this.
I mean, I'd be very interested in some examples of things that have worked at a community level. Perhaps you could write to us about those separately. But Torquil Crichton, I suspect, has got some.
Just to pick up on the point Weira's making. Hello, Fintan and Kayte. Welcome. Thanks for your expertise and your evidence. Isn't one of the best ways to engage communities to give them a direct share in the profit flowing through the pylons? And isn't one of the lessons from Ireland and Denmark and Germany that the larger the community share of these projects, the more they're accepted?
So that is one of the options. It works better for generation facilities, so renewable or generation facilities where there is a profit stream, if you like, coming out of it. And I know that some developers here talk about doing that, and there are some ways that you can potentially do that at a community level, which is potentially really, really powerful, and potentially those community energy schemes provide a way to unlock the deployment of some of that renewable resource that we need. It's harder to structure it in that way for transmission because a profit share thing isn't quite. The experience in Ireland was that it's sort of a proposal that had two elements to it. So for a linear infrastructure, so a line or whatever, you created a fund, and it was basically £1 per kilometre fund. One of the key things was that it wasn't the company that decided how that money was spent in the community. It was actually you established a group of trustees within that community that could themselves decide for our community what matters to us, this is where it should go. That was one element, and the other element was a payment directly to homeowners who were within a certain distance of a transmission line. So those worked. For generation facilities, it tend to be different approaches by different developers to doing it. But it did help. Again, it's not a silver bullet. I've talked to colleagues around Europe, and different things work. Different schemes work in different ways in different jurisdictions, I'd say, and it's about finding what is the right one that fits for the particular communities here.
Thank you very much. Chris Chope.
Can I ask about connection reform? First of all, when we define connection reform, it's basically the rationing of access to the distribution network. Is that really what it is?
I would describe connection reform really in two parts. One is ensuring that we've got the right processes in place to be able to bring connections that are ready and are needed or strategically aligned with what GB needs, and get them onto the system. That's part one of connections reform. The other part of connections reform is, as we've talked a little bit about, is ensuring that the network then exists to be able to move that power around the country to where demand is. It isn't about restricting access. What I will say, though, is the queue as it currently stands is massively oversubscribed. So our system today, about a 50 gigawatt system, and there is 750 gigawatts of connection applications currently in the queue. So I wouldn't describe it as restricting access. I would describe it of ensuring that we can connect what is needed and what is ready.
But what you decide to do is, instead of allowing the price mechanism, for example, to be used in order to prioritise applications for connections, you are, as a regulator, basically imposing your decisions, and that's why I use the expression rationing, because it is essentially you are taking the decision as to who can get to the top of the queue, and you're doing it not on the basis of price, but on the basis of other factors, many of which may not be disclosed.
So it's really important, and I think it's the case today, and it will be the case going forward, that connections, processes, rules, codes are completely transparent. There's nothing going on behind the scenes about decisions we're taking about what connects and what doesn't connect to the grid. Historically, we've had purely a first come, first served process. So the next person in the queue to apply is the next person that gets connected. And currently that queue is so long, there is so much in the queue that some of the offers for connection are out in the back end of the 2030s. And that's just because of the sheer volume of projects that came before the last project on that first come, first served basis. Going forwards, the sort of the relative position of projects in the queue is retained, so we're not throwing the whole queue up in the air. What we are doing, though, is removing from the queue projects that are speculative, have really no intention ever of connecting, and are simply getting in the way of other good projects that are sitting behind them in the queue.
So yesterday you made a fresh announcement with revising some earlier proposals. What do you think the impact is of that, and why did you make those revisions?
Yeah, so the decisions that we set out yesterday for me was a really positive set of decisions, very much grounded in the feedback that we've had from stakeholders through the extensive consultation that we've done on these reforms. These reforms are, maybe 1 in 10-year type reforms. It's really important that we consulted and heard from developers what they need to ensure certainty and confidence in the processes. The biggest change that we announced yesterday was around ensuring that projects that are already proven to be good projects, they're well developed, people have invested money in them, they've applied for planning permission and indeed been granted planning permission, can now be assured entry into the queue. That was the big change that we made yesterday, was to say if you've been granted planning permission, then your place in the queue is assured.
And there are other elements of that as well, but there's concern being expressed that a lot of projects will still not get past the starting line and past your regulations. So 90, for example, your report talks of 90% of solar projects should be allocated to the distribution network. Why 90%, or why not 100%?
So projects get allocated onto the system where where they're appropriately sized to be located, if you like. So local solar, community solar developments that are of a size that it is appropriate to connect to the distribution network should connect to the distribution network, reserving space on the transmission network for the bigger projects that do need to connect at that level.
Shouldn't we be just making a bigger distribution network so that it covers the country in the same way as the gas grid does?
Maybe just a point of clarification. It's not that 90% would be allocated to the distribution network and the other 10% will go away. The other 10% are connecting to the transmission network. So, and that's just based on the size and scale of the queue that we have seen to date. Projects in the solar projects are typically of a size and scale that would connect to the distribution network. There are some really big sort of what we would call utility scale solar that would connect to the transmission network.
Like the one that was swept away by Storm Dara in Anglesey. That was connected to the distribution network?
Don't know the specifics of that one.
Oh, you didn't see the pictures? I mean, it's a complete scene of carnage.
Okay.
Of, I think, was it 19 acres of wind farm completely destroyed. But anyway, I'm sure the Chinese manufacturers will benefit from being able to renew all that. But can I ask you also about how precisely you're going to determine which projects are strategically aligned? I mean, you say, who's going to decide this? Is somebody in your office going to decide it, or are there going to be criteria so that people know in advance?
Yep, so strategic alignment will be alignment in the first instance by government's Clean Power Action Plan, so aligned to what that plan says we need in terms of how much of any given technology in any given location. And then over time, strategic alignment will be alignment to sort of future plans. So the SSEP then will pick up and...
So colloquially, it's so the man in Whitehall knows best. And that's really what we're talking about, isn't it?
No. What's important is that we connect to the grid the level of infrastructure that is needed to meet clean power and to bring sort of economic benefit and growth to GB. There is a limit to how much generation connection we need on the system, and whether it's through the Clean Power Plan or through future strategic plans, it's really important that we send that signal of how much of a given technology is needed, and demand is uncapped, so we can bring as much demand onto the system as possible. And again,
can I just ask one more question?
We're going to move on. So this is your
Can
last,
I just, on the time scale, just quickly, because I'm told that originally you were saying that you might not be able to indicate which projects were needed until the end of 2025 or early 2026. Is that still the situation, or have you been able to advance that timetable? Because that length of wait is very bad for investors.
So what we've been able to do through things like the announcements we made yesterday is give greater certainty to the projects that definitely will be able to connect, that they will be in the queue. So projects that have planning permission know that they will be in the queue and they can continue through their development process. That's really clear. That was one of the big benefits of the announcement made yesterday. More broadly, we do need to follow due process and make sure that we follow the codes and the rules, and that we, as we make these changes, these reforms to the processes, that we do it in the proper way. And that means there are timelines set out in codes that we must follow. Those timelines will see us take a majority of 2025. But, to be really clear, projects that are ready, so meet the readiness criteria, which have very transparently been set out, and have the planning permission that they need, and are in line with the level of connection that will be set out in the Clean Power Plan, it will be clear to those projects that they should have a place in the queue.
Just to confirm absolutely something you just said about projects with planning consent. Can you confirm that any project with planning consent by May 2025 will be shielded from the impact of your grid connections reforms?
That's right. If the planning application was submitted before the 20th of December, which is when we will submit our final fully formed proposal to Ofgem, and if that planning permission is granted by May, then those projects will be in the queue.
Now, something you said, I think, before, can you confirm absolutely that no real projects will be removed following the revisions yesterday?
So, projects that are ready, which means that they can demonstrate that they've met the milestones that are set out in the readiness criteria, have planning permission and are aligned with need, will have a place at what we call Gate 2 in the queue, so they'll have a firm connection offer in a firm location for a firm level of power. Other projects, so projects, for example, that may not meet the readiness criteria, may not be at Gate 2, they may sit at what we call Gate 1, which is, they're still waiting and can come forward as and when they are ready to do so. They will not be removed from the queue if they are good projects.
So a project could be at Gate 1 and be removed?
A project could be at Gate 1, and if it doesn't meet its milestones, if it can't demonstrate that it is actually intending to connect to the system, then it would ultimately be removed.
Just back to something that Chris said. You've said already offshore wind is challenging, and you've got two different targets for the two different pathways. Why are you limiting solar?
So we are proposing a trebling of solar in the CP30 plan. That feels like actually a significant increase in the level of solar to be connected to the system. It doesn't feel like a limitation.
Yeah. Solar Energy UK is saying that generation by 2030 could be 59.6 gigawatts. Your target is 47.4. That is, 15 to 20% lower?
Yeah, so for all of the technologies that are set out in the plan, as we went round and engaged with vast multitude of stakeholders, we got different perspectives on the level of sort of what is possible and what might come forward. We are confident that the 47 gigawatts that we've set out in the plan it is a meaningful increase. We really want that solar generation on the system. It is important, an important part of the system. It is the level that we came to based on our analysis, our modelling and extensive engagement with stakeholders.
And you accept that solar is one of the two cheapest forms of generation, along with onshore wind?
Yeah, and it's a very important technology for us.
Right.
Thank you, Chair. Hello again, Fintan and Kate. To follow on from what Chris was saying, and to turn back to community energy and community energy generation, my new best friends, Jorgen Meyer and Michael Shanks, have both said that they want to see 8 gigawatts of power coming from community generation. Yet your connection plans don't mention community energy at all.
So our plans do have significant amounts of onshore wind and solar, as we've just discussed, and typically those are the types of projects that would become community energy projects. When we think about those sort of generation assets, we think about them as a generation type, and community energy sort of in and of itself, if you like, is an ownership structure rather than any sort of assessment of the generation. So we want onshore wind, we want solar, we feel very strongly, and as NESO, I hope we're demonstrating that we feel very strongly about the importance of bringing communities with us as we go on this energy transition. We think community energy projects are a great way of doing that. We just don't call them out as community energy projects here. We just, consistent with all of the technology types, articulate how much of any given technology we think is needed.
Why not would be my next question, because if you're winnowing out the zombie projects, but keeping your queue, your gateways 1 and 2, if you don't designate community energy, and if you don't give community energy projects a derogation to get connected quicker, they won't get connected at all, because they don't have the backup, the professional backup, or the legal team or the technical teams that corporations have, and they're competing with corporations to get on the grid.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important, I think, that as we develop these connection reforms and implement them, they are absolutely fair, that they don't in any way either sort of disincentivise or favour any particular sort of technology type or particular project. I think it's just an important part of those rules, of those processes. That said, we are working really hard to make sure that we don't sort of inadvertently, if you like, disincentivise community energy projects. And with that in mind, we've spent a lot of time actually engaging with developers who are developing those projects and organisations who are representing those sort of projects, to make sure that we're hearing their voices and playing that into the consultation feedback that we're getting, and then responding to it accordingly.
Yeah, but if you categorise them as a technological solution rather than an ownership model, you are disadvantaging them. Do you need, Chris talked about the man from Whitehall deciding, do you need a signal from Jorgen and from Shanks to say that they want community energy projects to have a derogation, to skip the queue, for lack of better words, to give priority? Because I can tell you, without support from communities through community energy projects, getting support for the other stuff is going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, certainly to the extent that we were sent that signal by government, and of course that is a signal that we would follow. And the team at DESNES have worked really closely with us as well in developing these reform proposals. We spend a lot of time, as I say, talking about communities. We also spend a lot of time similarly talking about demand projects, and how do we ensure that we can not get in the way of those getting connected to the grid as well. So the conversations are happening under the current framework as I described. We don't favour particular technologies or ownership models, but I absolutely hear the point about the importance of communities in this regard.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, how will you ensure that all these kind of regional energy strategic planners engage with communities? Do you need a signal on that too, or do you have a system for doing that?
So the regional energy strategic planners, this new role that NESO will fulfil, actually that community engagement is at the very heart of that model. We don't need any further signal than the mandate that's been set out for us in establishing that role. These teams will sit out in the regions. We will stand up sort of new offices and new teams, and we'll recruit those teams from the local area where possible. We'll recruit folks who understand local authorities, who understand the communities that they're operating in, who understand the dynamics of that particular region and can really help us translate that into regional ambitions, regional plans, and plans that ultimately can come together to align with the national plan. It's absolutely at the heart of how we're setting ourselves up.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Fintan.
Thank you. Josh McAllister.
Just taking a step back to the previous discussion that Chris was taking us through the questions on, which goes back to the changes you announced yesterday around connections reforms. So I just wanted to understand a bit more about the relationship between capping the number of projects that can hold connections for a year with the need for CFDs to be competitive, and how you've weighed up those tensions.
So
maybe just say a little bit more about where you see the tension, because I think that I'm not sure that there is a. Maybe I misunderstood the question.
So
sorry.
The idea that in order to have a really competitive contract for different auctions, that you need a wide number of businesses bidding into those auctions, and through the capping of potential projects within a year, the risk is you may end up reducing the competition that takes place that we're able to pick from through a CFD auction. You may not think that is a risk.
Projects are only eligible to enter a CFD auction if they hold a connection date in the delivery year for that auction. So that's limiting the potential numbers of bidders.
It shouldn't do. I mean, and we will just take that away and just make sure that there isn't an unintended consequence. So obviously, there's no intention here to try to make CFD auctions less competitive or to remove that competitive tension. I don't think there is, but we will take it away. It's a very valid question. So
thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Good. So I'm going to just go back to solar again briefly. One of the concerns raised with this is what is happening in Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire and in Zone 9. What we're being told is there are 4 gigawatts of solar farms that could still lose their grid connections. What's the logic of replacing active projects with phantom projects that don't exist? Because in addition, in your plan, you identify fossil fuel projects which don't exist. And just to add to the mix, there's 1.5 gigawatts of solar identified for London. Difficult to see where that's going to go. So there seem to be some inconsistencies here and some gaps in the logic.
So I can't comment to the specific projects that you raised, but the approach that we have taken essentially, and as I said, it's really important that we retain the value of the existing queue, the order within which projects have already applied to the existing queue, and we use that order to determine sort of the volume of any given technology by region, by understanding what was already sort of in the queue in that area. Good projects should not be getting stopped by phantom projects, to use your language there, Chair, because the very reforms that we've created are absolutely intended to ensure that those phantom projects, or zombie projects, as you might have heard us refer to them previously, cannot stay in the queue because they cannot demonstrate that they are fulfilling the requirements to either be in the queue in the first place or stay in the queue if they are not progressing. So we should see that progress of projects coming forward. Remember I talked about massive oversubscription, and lots of the projects we think in the queue are speculative. these reforms will see them exit, and as they exit, good projects that are sitting behind them that are ready and would like to come forward will be able to move forward and have earlier connection dates.
Right. Okay. We may come back to you in writing.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Claire, you're next.
So turning now to the question of demand flexibility. So the government's got a current target of 75% of homes and 69% of small businesses having smart meters by the end of 2025. So the first question is, do you think that's enough for demand flexibility to grow by 4 to 5 times current levels, which you say we need by 2030?
So the smart meter rollout is certainly a complex one. From our point of view, it's as many homes as soon as possible, I think, is the way I would describe it. With smart metering, we will have access to data that will really help us to understand what it will take to unlock that level of demand-side flexibility, and for the industry to be able to respond to that and, you know, create, innovate, develop new tools and new services by which customers, consumers can absolutely engage, bring that demand flexibility to the fore and provide that value to the system and be rewarded for it accordingly. You do need smart metering for that. You need half-hourly metering as well. From our perspective, we would like both of those things as quickly as possible.
So if you're looking for that sort of innovation in the consumer retail market, what regulatory changes do you think you'll need to ensure that value, you talk about, you know, the customers need to be rewarded, what regulatory changes would you need for that to happen so that it can be passed to the consumers in the form of lower electricity bills?
I think what we really need is the supply industry, the suppliers, to be able to have the confidence that, you know, the regulations are in place, the market structures are in place for them to be able to invest in developing those products and services confidently, and that they can then onboard customers to them. For our part, there is certainly something that we can do to help unlock demand flexibility as well. It's not all on suppliers. So you might be familiar, over the last couple of winters, we ran a service called the Demand Flexibility Service. I don't know if any of you heard about it. We had 2.6 million customers and businesses, consumers and businesses, sign up to the Demand Flexibility Service. They're really sending us that signal that they want to participate. There is an appetite to provide those services. We were able to construct something that was attractive. We were able to get the suppliers on board to work with us to offer that service to their customers. And from a system perspective, from a system operability perspective, we saw great value from it. So it's not just us, it's not just the suppliers, but there is certainly a lot to do, I think, to unlock the levels of demand flex that we talk about in our report.
Be a bit more specific about what the regulatory changes are. And what are you asking government to actually change about the regulations in order to make this happen? You sort of talked around what might be possible, and it is possible to construct something, but not what the changes are.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on regulation for the retail industry. I'll start there, but I think one of the critical things is finding a pathway to be able to introduce really effective time of use tariffs. And that really does require the meters to be installed, and it does require half-hourly settlement on metering. So, you know, quick access to those things will be critically important to be able to design and implement those tariffs. But I'm sure the retail suppliers have got a much more comprehensive list of regulatory changes they would like to see.
Need a written questions or something. Finally, talking about the potential of vehicle-to-grid technology. So in your future energy scenarios, 2024, identify several key actions needed in order to realise that potential. Given that 2030 is only 5 years away, which of these are the highest priority?
Certainly vehicle to grid is one of the best sources of flexibility that we saw, and you can see that in the Clean Power Advice. It is sort of the biggest chunk in the graph when you look at domestic flexibility or vehicle to grid flexibility. But you need the deployment of the fleet of EVs, you need the charging infrastructure, but you also need the digital infrastructure such that they can communicate. So that piece around how is it easy for domestic customers to hook up, get an EV tariff with an EV supplier, and all of that information interchange. So we have an initiative called a digital system integration, so what we call DSI, which is around trying to develop that digital spine through the energy industry that will allow that exchange of information to be much, much easier and much, much more transparent. I think on the vehicle to grid one as well, there is still, so we've seen great take-up for the fleet that's there in smart charging. And we've talked to some of the suppliers, with one of them only yesterday, talking about the really brilliant algorithms they have that will do that. And that is one part of the flexibility. But building that out to be truly vehicle to grid and the two-way communication does require a step change in terms of both people's attitude to what that means for my vehicle and my car, right? What it's going to do for my battery, but also the technology and the to get the power through. So you need the smart meters, you need the infrastructure in there as well. So to get the vehicle to grid stuff, I think we're seeing a lot of progress on the smart charging stuff, which is really, really great. The step change will be to get the real vehicle to grid going.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Josh McAllister.
Yeah, it'd be good to talk a bit about industrial electrification. So in the organisation's previous guise, in the Future Energy Scenarios 2024, you called for a review of the electricity and gas retail price difference to encourage industry to electrify. Are you of the view of going a step further to calling for a review to say that you think that the policy costs for electricity should go to general taxation? Have you got a view on that question?
No, not specifically on that question, no, but certainly the question of how policy costs are divided between the two does need to be looked at, and we are talking to the industrial representative groups around what it would take to electrify, but not only that, how as they do that can they provide more flexibility back to the system. So I had a great conversation with someone only the other day around how do we think more about demand flexibility from the perspective of the demand customer whose main business is not energy or providing energy. Their main business is, maybe it's a supermarket selling stuff off the shelves, but they have huge levels of demand. So how do we get that demand flexibility in place? So I don't think we have an issue on. I don't think we have a firm issue on the policy question of moving costs into taxation. No.
Well, your example there is a good one to pick up on because, for example, Denmark now has a limited network access tariff that offers large energy users with flexible demand substantial discounts. Is that the kind of thing that you would like to see us use here with industrial users?
So I don't know the specifics of the tariff you're talking about in Denmark, but certainly that type of thing is potentially very interesting. I think that one of the things we potentially have to get better at, though, is finding ways that the flexibility or the tariff structures work not just for the electricity system and providing the benefits to make the system overall cost lower, but also work for the individual industry or whatever. So I'll go back to my example that I was talking about the supermarket, right? They have loads of chillers that they can actually turn off, but only for short periods of time, and only if they keep the temperature in the chiller within a certain band, and they're absolutely intolerant to going outside of that band because they've loads of health and safety regulations absolutely appropriately around that. So thinking about what is there for the tariff structure that might work for them would be maybe different to what's the tariff structure that works for a new AI data center, for example. But I think being flexible in terms of how we think about that is really important.
Right, and then the final one is what role you expect thermal batteries to play, and the sort of trade-off with other forms of technology for industrial users.
Batteries in general, or are you thinking about sort of thermal batteries for heat storage?
Heat storage, yeah.
Heat storage. So I think potentially they do have a role. I'm not sure that they have hit commercial scale on the electricity system. I think they may have a very interesting role, though, when you think about heat networks. So if you think about heat networks, and then you think about, well, how does that integrate with the electricity system? Having something that bridges that in a flexible way is something that could potentially be very useful. I think at the moment what we're seeing is lithium-ion just winning the race on batteries on the electricity system. There is a lot of innovation and investment going into sort of other battery technologies, flow-based batteries, etc. And I'm sure some of them will come forward and compete with sort of lithium-ion batteries. But the heat storage and heat batteries, I think probably at the moment the sort of most obvious use would be in that link to sort of maybe district heat systems and how they might be deployed in a way that is sympathetic to the electricity system.
Thank you.
Young, please.
So last week we were asking questions of the Minister about the future role of hydrogen. I'd like to ask you, the future energy scenarios 2024 envisage a range of possible uses of hydrogen by 2050. When do you think we need to make real choices and prioritise between those different possible uses?
So I think hydrogen will definitely play a role in the energy system. I don't think there's one decision, though, around hydrogen. I think there's a multiplicity of decisions because you talk about the range of uses that it can have. I think the one that has got the most airtime and discussion is around the role of hydrogen in domestic heat. And certainly how you decarbonise domestic heat in Great Britain is one of the more tricky issues, I think, around that transition to net zero, how you do that. And what role, if any, hydrogen plays in that thing, I think, is a decision that will need to be made in the next number of years by government as it thinks about sort of the future role of gas, the gas networks, and of hydrogen on the system. I think, as I say, though, hydrogen will play a role. There's certainly a role in decarbonising the hard-to-abate sectors and potentially some of the heavy transport sectors as well. So you can see hydrogen playing a role there. Could also play a role in the electricity system, specifically around storage, right? So to the extent that you use hydrogen as a storage vector, potentially created, using electrolysis at times of excess electricity demand, excess electricity generation, and you use electrolysis to produce hydrogen, you could potentially store it in some of the salt caverns or disused oil and gas fields, and then sort of repump it out and into CCGTs. That is one other use of storage on the electricity. And then the other one that I talked about is around heat. And I'm sorry, just you were asking about decision times, apologies. I mean, there are ongoing discussions and negotiations around hydrogen in the clusters that are going on at the moment. And those, I think, will continue. I don't think there's a sort of at what point does it become we go all in on hydrogen? There are...
Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry, the last one I was going to mention was just around the hydrogen for heat. So there is the heat in people's homes, and that is a really difficult one. There's also, though, heat networks. You could potentially see hydrogen playing a role in running the heat networks and being the source of fuel for those on a sort of district heating type of basis as well. Sorry, I cut you off there.
So you've run through the different options, but I think, would you not agree that at some point you have to take a strategic overview of those options? Because we will only ever have a limited, there will be a finite amount of green hydrogen that we can produce. So do we not need at some point to make a choice and say we're prioritising the use of hydrogen for this, this and this? If you just make decisions as you go on each possible use, does that not leave you possibly not having taken that strategic overview?
All right, apologies. So I do agree, and I think there are maybe two bits to it. So I think in a lot of those cases, though, it's still at the point of investing to prove the technology. So some of those, so that take that electricity storage example I gave you. The round trip economics on that at the moment are pretty horrible in terms of sort of the losses as you convert between different energy vectors. Though investment and commercialisation, and it's not just happening here in GB but around the world, should drive down those costs. We saw it with other technologies, great examples being offshore wind and batteries, right? But the strategic overlay piece, I think that comes through in the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, because that provides the opportunity to step back and look at what are those big ticket things that GB needs as we develop the energy system out to, as Kayte said, 2040, 2045, 2050. And in that that's the place where you would explore, well, what is the electrolyzer capacity that we need? What are the uses then of that hydrogen? Is it going into storage? How much of it is going into international market for sale or whatever? So that SSEP, I think, provides an overview way. It provides a strategic overlay that allows you to assess what the different options are at a high level, I hope.
Okay, so I think you've possibly partly answered my next question, but what decisions do we need from government now to build up the capacity required to meet our the capacity for green hydrogen production, that is, in order to meet our net zero targets?
So in my head there's sort of three things, I think. One is continuing to explore hydrogen in the cluster, so that sort of work that's already underway, which should ultimately lead to commercialisation and driving down costs. So I think that's sort of underway. I don't know that there's a big sort of decision needed. Secondly is on the electrolyzer piece, and I think that needs the actual whole system assessment, because that interlinks between how you think about network, how you think about different generation resources, how you think about security of supply. So I think you need that SSEP assessment, which will feed into government through the end of next year. So at the end of 2026, we'll have sort of pathways or options under SSEP developed, which should enable that discussion. And then I think the final piece in terms of a decision by government is around that hydrogen for heat and the role of that. And I think that is probably a distinct policy decision that's needed over the next number of years.
Two further questions, hopefully fairly quick answers. Do we need to limit our future use of blue hydrogen, given that means we've got continued exposure to international gas prices and there's the risk of methane leakage?
Do we need to limit it?
Our future use of blue hydrogen.
I think what you'd want to see, though, is a transition from blue to green. I think the use of blue hydrogen enables you to build the supply chains around it while the sort of deployment of green hydrogen is at a nascent sense. But you would sort of see the green hydrogen level of green hydrogen production rising, and you would see the level of blue hydrogen. You wouldn't set a
limit at this point and say this is what the limit should be at this point in time.
I don't think so. I don't think that we have the analysis that would say that.
Okay. And Do you agree with the Climate Change Committee that from 2025 the government should prohibit new buildings from connecting to the gas grid?
That is a policy question for government. I don't think we have a particular view on that in terms of what that should be.
Very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will be voting soon. We'll try and get through the remaining questions before. What decisions do you need from the government and when to assume your full responsibilities for planning hydrogen transport and storage?
Sorry, Chair. What decisions do you mean by government when to enable?
You're taking over responsibility for
yes.
planning hydrogen transport and storage. When do you need decisions by? Or what decisions do you need and when do you need them by?
It's a continuing and ongoing conversation, actually, and we've been working really closely with government as to when is the appropriate time for us to pick up that role, and that is a little ways down the road, I think 2026, and trying to work through exactly what that role looks like, and then therefore what we would need sort of from government along the way to help us pick up that role and have the full capability to and be really clear on what that role is going forward. So sitting here right now, I don't have a view on exactly what decisions and what timeline, but I will say, government engaged extensively with us on what is the value of having NESO undertake this role, what can we learn from where we've got these strategic planning roles in other vectors, and set ourselves up appropriately for that.
Okay, now you've called for more clarity on how hydrogen pipelines will be built and gas networks repurposed. What are the most urgent questions?
So I think as we think about developing a hydrogen network, there is a trade-off between, so there is a gas network there, obviously, and that can transport gas, and they've done tests, and most of it can also transport hydrogen. The question, I think, is how do you manage that transition while we still rely on the gas network? So both for providing power or providing gas to power stations, providing gas to people's homes to heat them, providing gas to industry, to the extent that you repurpose some of that gas grid and you sort of carve it out of the main transmission system, the NTS, and you designate it as a hydrogen pipeline, you have taken something out of the gas grid. So I think there's an ongoing discussion that we are having with National Gas Transmission and the gas networks around, well, how do you do that? Because you don't want to overbuild and build another pipeline if actually taking one out, but you can't just assume that you can remove a pipeline, obviously, from the gas network and designate it as hydrogen if that has an undue impact on security of supply. So it is an ongoing discussion and analysis that we are doing in conjunction with National Gas and the gas businesses to try, and that will come through in things like the gas network needs analysis report, and National Gas will now come back with sort of options around that as well.
Cool. Thank you. And what are the immediate next steps to increase hydrogen storage capacity, given that salt caverns can take 12 years to develop? Or is this going to be another ongoing discussion?
Well, so I think it comes back to the earlier conversation, though, around having that strategic view of how much storage of hydrogen do we need. So I think that needs the SSEP to do that assessment about what is. So we see hydrogen playing a role, yes, in the electricity system, in the energy system as a whole, but I think we need to do that sort of strategic assessment overall before you could say it is a storage facility on the size and scale of Rough, or is it something significantly smaller like one of the ones that are there today.
Right. Thank you very much for your answers about hydrogen. I'm going to go back again to what we've been asking you a lot about, because we have some investors and developers who are extremely concerned. Kate O'Neill, when you talked about Gate 2, and I think you said that projects with planning at Gate 2 would be secure, but in your report it's only land and grid that are relevant for Gate 2. Have you changed that now to include planning?
Yeah, so having consulted on the methodologies that we had proposed for connections reform, we got a huge amount of feedback through that consultation process. And the open letter that we published yesterday set out how we'd taken that feedback on board and were making some revisions to our proposals. And that change, locking in projects with planning permission, was a change that we just announced in that letter yesterday.
They have to have planning permission?
Indeed,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up.
Just one quickie.
Go on.
Thank you. I've received a letter from somebody called Bill Rees, whom I don't know, but he is the managing director of NESO Energy. And he says that the Clean Power 2030 report doesn't take account of the benefits of co-located sites, with each technology considered separately. Co-location optimises grid use and thereby reduces costs for consumers, networks and investors. Ignoring this could double the expense and scarce grid infrastructure required to achieve the clean power target. Can you outline the reasons for co-location not being recognised in the Clean Power 2030 report, please?
Yeah, so we haven't ignored co-location, but what we've had to do is, in order to ensure that we're clear on sort of what technologies are needed where, and then ensuring that we can get those technologies connected to the grid, we've had to take a view on when you look at any hybrid connections, so connections where it's two technologies co-located together, how do you think about them? And the decision that we took was that you, whichever is the primary generating source, we sort of consider that the main source of that technology. So it's not that we didn't think about it, but we had to have a way to...
But why was that the wise decision, bearing in mind what he says? Was that a wise decision to take, bearing in mind the point that he makes, that the consequence of doing that is that it may well actually add to the cost of transmission?
So we do support and enable co-located facilities. So a great example is batteries at wind farm sites. So there's several of the current offshore wind farm developers looking at co-locating significant scale batteries alongside that sort of hybrid approach. So we're very much in favour of that. And as Kayte said, you still need the transmission capacity there. To the extent that that can be leveraged for more effect, then that's great. And I think the other part is back to the earlier conversation about connections and the queue. We need to be really fair, open and transparent with people around how they progress through the queue, and we're not throwing out the existing queue, so it is the projects that are in there. So to the extent there are developers in there who have applications that leverage co-location, then that is absolutely great. But there are great examples of where we're working with developers on co-located projects. As I say, some really terrific examples of batteries connecting your wind farms.
And then I'm going to come back to one more question where I don't think I had an answer, which is, where's this 1.5 gigawatts of solar in London going to be? Because no one can see can think of a site where it can be. Don't give me, please.
So
that's a lot of rooftop.
It is a lot of rooftop solar. So I can't obviously point to the precise location. What I can say is that NESO isn't doing any of this work by ourselves. All of this work is being done with the local network companies, so with UPN in London. And to the extent that London cannot accommodate that level of solar, the way the rules work is that that can shift between adjacent regions. So you would build more of another technology in London and you would move some of that capacity to the adjacent region. So it's not completely binary or completely fixed. We've built some of that flexibility into the process.
Okay. Yes, I think that might pose more questions than it answers to developers who are worried about about what is indicated in the regions around the country. But we may well write to you again. Similarly, if there are things that you would like to write to us about following this session, please do. And with that, can I thank you, Kayte O'Neill and Fintan Slye, for your evidence this afternoon. The session is suspended. Order.